All right. My name is Kelsey Dew, and I'm affiliated with the Edgecombe County Veterans Military Museum. And it is June 1st, 2017, and we are located in Tarboro, North Carolina. And the purpose for this interview is to capture the experiences of Mr. Gordon Campbell's during his military involvement. Can you please state your first name?
Gordon, Gordon.
And your middle and last name.
Miro, Merow, and Campbell, Campbell.
And when is your date of birth?
April 3rd, 1920.
And what branch of service?
The Navy.
And what years did you serve in?
I guess 43 to 46.
Okay. And what was your highest rank?
Chief Petty Officer.
So why did you decide to join the Navy?
Well, it was because I heard that the Navy was looking for navigators to fly a cargo operation from New York to the front using big flying boats that were currently being produced in California, like Consolidated. And the Navy was having second doubts about how they could cope with the submarine menace. And they thought one way would be to divert some of their production from patrol bombers that were called PB-2Ys. It was the follow-on of the PBY, and divert them for cargo operation. And they changed them to have a cargo floor, took all the armaments off. I think they had to add an astrodome for navigation, and they were a very big airplane. They had a flight deck like a bridge of a ship, and they were quite effective as a cargo plane. But eventually, when the Army developed big airports at the primary locations of Casa Blanca, the Azores, Scotland, Newfoundland, why it was much easier to use land planes that could be loaded and unloaded faster. And that's the general picture.
Excellent. Where did you enlist at?
Well, I can't remember too well. We had to join the Navy Reserve and be educated by a airline that had a contract to train crews and begin operations ready to be taken over by the Navy. And so all of my experience was changing my knowledge of marine navigation to flight navigation, which is quite a change because things move so fast with an airplane, and you don't have to be quite so precise. But I'd always been interested in navigation. I liked it, and I thought I also liked the idea of flying rather than being on a ship with a good chance of being torpedoed. So I took the training, checked out as a flight navigator, and I must have made 6 or 7 flights across the South Atlantic. It was a long process, though. You started from New York, and your first stop was Bermuda, and then Puerto Rico, and Trinidad and the British Guianas and the island in the Amazon where Pan Am had a big base. The Navy took over all of Pan Am's facilities and all of the other airline that was a competitor, American Export Airlines. And so the route was, as I say, sort of ended at this island in the Amazon, and from there you made the transatlantic thing in not one flight, a stopover at Natal, Brazil, which projects way out into the Atlantic, and refueled and flew to Africa, where there was a place that I think Pan Am had a base. And from there, we would fly to a French naval base we'd taken over near Casa Blanca called Port Loyautey, Lyautey, I think. It was on a river, and the first flight I made there was kind of interesting. We started out from that island in the Amazon, and it was 37 hours on duty. We had to stop at Natal for gas, and made the flight to Africa, refueled again, and flew to this airport near Casablanca. And they had just landed on North Africa, and we landed at dusk, and it quickly turned dark, and there were absolutely no lights. They were afraid of bombers from the German Air Force. So we went in a Jeep that had two blue lights to show that there was a Jeep there, and went to a girls' school, which had been taken over for billeting people that had just come in. And I was put in the girls' infirmary, and in the pitch dark, and I woke up in the morning on a gurney looking up at a operating room light, and I wondered, have we crashed? Or I felt all over, I'm okay. But I gradually realized that it was not a hospital, it was a girls' infirmary. So that was kind of an interesting anecdote. I must have made about 7 flights like that across the South Atlantic. And then the operation moved to the North Atlantic, and we flew from New York to Newfoundland, and Newfoundland to either Iceland or directly to a lake on Northern Ireland called Loch Ness, I can't remember the spelling, but the RAF had a base there, and they had a pier and a boat that could unload these big flying boats. And I probably made about 4 trips like that across the North Atlantic. And the plane was an interesting plane. It had a flight deck that was very big compared to most flight airplanes you see nowadays. And the crew consisted of 3 pilots, 2 flight engineers, 2 radio operators, a navigator, and a purser that would be in charge of the cargo. And I loved navigation. I liked the job. I always wanted to be a flyer, but didn't know how to go about it, I guess. Anyhow, that's about somewhere, I guess it was around 1944, that they discontinued this operation, and we were transferred to the Air Transport Command under the Army using 4-engine DC-4s, which in the Navy were called RFD. And I forget the Army transport name, but they were very efficient. And they were the ones that were used eventually in the Berlin airlift. And there were a lot of them. And we were flying back and forth to Casa Blanca for a long time, and then to Scotland. The trip with these planes would be more like New York to Newfoundland, Newfoundland to Iceland, and Iceland to Scotland. And sometimes the wind was such that you could avoid the stop at Iceland, but almost always had to make it going west against the prevailing winds. And I enjoyed flying and navigation, and I feel kind of guilty that I never had a shot fired at me in anger, and enjoyed what I was doing. When other guys, like in the bomber group from Britain, they'd leave on a flight and would never know whether they were going to come back, and the losses were tremendous. That's an aside. And we'd bring back some wounded soldiers and airmen to New York, and they'd have ambulances waiting there to take them to a hospital. And that was kind of feeling that you were really doing something that was more important than carrying this cargo, which was, we never knew exactly what was in the cargo. We had one joke one time, though, that a big part of it was toilet paper, which, when you think about it, is kind of critical. Yeah. Well, I don't want to talk a lot, but does that sound like it's enough?
It does. I do have a few questions I would like to ask you, though. When you were serving, was there any integration between African Americans and whites within your unit, or where you were with the transition of the? Oh, good Lord! I'm sorry. With flight navigating, was it an integrated force at that point?
No, I don't remember any black flyers either in any of the crew that I worked with, and I don't believe there were any, I'm sorry to say.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, that's something that I'm interested in, with the integration of the military during World War II, and so that's why I asked, is because it starts to become common at that time frame, but then you still have people who didn't serve with anybody but their race.
Right.
So I'm highly interested in that component of serving especially during World War II. Are you from Edgecombe County?
Yes.
Yes, that's one thing I meant to ask. So, and did you grow up here your whole life?
No, I grew up in New Jersey.
And is that where you were when you enlisted? Was up in New Jersey, or how did you end up in Edgecombe County?
Well, my daughter came here to teach, and my wife had a debilitating disease that we needed a place like the Albemarle, where there was a nursing home associated with it. And so we moved here, and I liked the Albemarle. I moved in first in 1997, and it was supposed to be on a trial basis, but took a little getting used to, but my wife was very happy here. Much better than living alone with me, even though I could cope with everything she needed. But here she had a lot of people that liked her, and it's a nice environment here if you know, if you don't play recluse. There's a lot of people that you can talk to and are friendly, and that's, as I say, much better than being alone at home. And so I stayed here after she died because it was a good place to be, I thought. Did a lot of traveling when I was younger, and I have a son in Hawaii who lives and works there, and I'd go every February for a week or 3 weeks in Hawaii. He knew where to get the low-cost rents, and a couple times I stayed with him. And then later on, I had a lady friend here, and we went there together, so we would go in a low-cost motel, a hotel, I should say. And it was a wonderful time. I love Hawaii. It's a great place. But my son also, another son, had relatives in France, so he asked if we'd like to take a trip to France with he and his wife, my daughter, and the two of us, and we had almost a month in France, and at places where there were relatives of my son, so it was much different than living in a hotel and just sort of experiencing the top level of, you were right in there and you felt like a Parisian for a while, and shopping around and going to the open markets. And then we went to Ireland, and I guess that's pretty much what we did traveling. And that made the time go fast here. And people ask me, how come you spend all that time here? But I didn't. I didn't do much going back to New York. I still have a grandson there, but they've mostly moved away. It's a very expensive place to live. And the house I had, none of my grandsons could afford to keep it up. It was the taxes and the electricity, everything added up to too much. And that's why, another reason why North Carolina is so good. You'd be surprised at the number of people up in New York that are talking about coming here, and I'm sure you know that they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the only thing bad is the income tax is pretty high, but if you got a big lump sum as a golden parachute, why, that's not a good place to come, because you take probably a third of that money would go to income tax for the state. Well, I'm wandering off the subject.
No, you're fine. And then there's one more thing I would like to ask. Did your military experience, how did your military experience transfer into your life afterwards?
Well, I immediately got a job after I got my, I forget what you call it when you get your final.
Your discharge.
My discharge. I immediately applied for a job with American Airlines, which was setting up an overseas operation. And at that time, franchises were given to the airlines, and American got a franchise to do Scandinavia, Germany, Holland, and England. And so I got a pretty high-level job in the navigation department, assistant chief, and I went on all of the first flights that were pretty well publicized everywhere we went. Like first flight to Oslo, first flight to Stockholm, first flight to Denmark, and to Holland. And every place we would take newspaper people on a flight of just to see what the airplane was like and hopefully get good reviews. And I had about 4 years with the airline before the technology came up with, GPS and things like that that made us obsolete. And I enjoyed that time thoroughly, and the pay was good. Put a little tough strain on my wife, bringing up 2 or 3 kids with me gone for almost a week. But then, because of all the flight time you got on a mission like that, you were entitled to probably 10 days off before you could fly again by FAA regulations. So for every time away, I would get more than equal time back. And they set me up with an office to check navigators, and I'd interview them when they came back about their trip, look at their chart. And so then I was only flying 1 trip a month, and that was pretty good. A little more easy with the home life. And eventually, though, American gave up that particular operation because Pan Am was able to sue for being sole flyer overseas, and Pan Am bought us, and immediately we were all discharged and got a telegram. And I had a little trouble finding a job, but I had been going to night school for engineering, finishing it up, and I got a job with Grumman Aircraft, where I worked for 40 years, and enjoyed the work. I was right in flight test, where you work with a finished airplane, and I worked till I was 70, and as a result of that, I'm getting a nice retirement and can afford the Albemarle, even though they keep kicking the rent up pretty high. So, is that enough?
That is. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. And before we go, is there anything that you would want the youth of today to know and that to remember about your time in the military, or in general World War II?
Particular incidents, you mean?
Or in general, what would, it's just something like advice. Let's say advice, or just something to remember, to not forget,
Well, we had one flight where, heading toward Casa Blanca, we got weather report that it was closed in, and so our alternate was Gibraltar, and the captain had never been there, so he elected to circle. It was dark now, circle till daylight before landing, and we made a particularly bad landing. They call it porpoising when you start bouncing up higher and higher, and I thought this plane is going to break up when we hit the last time, but it wasn't. And Yeah, I was ready to start swimming. And we got a lot of British airmen coming out. They'd never seen this big ponderous airplane, big 4-engine. And so it was kind of interesting. But we had to stay there overnight, and the barracks were really tough. I mean, those British people did not have any luxuries at all. But that was probably interesting to be at Gibraltar. That was quite a center of activity at that time.
Yes. Well, thank you, Mr. Campbell, so much for speaking with me. I really appreciate you taking your time.
Okay.
And let's see, I'm gonna